Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when French aristocrats gnawed on meat bones with their bare hands, wiped their greasy fingers on expensive tapestries, and threw chicken carcasses over their shoulders for the dogs. You're about to witness firsthand how one Italian teenager turned the barbaric French court into the birthplace of modern table manners, though you probably won't survive the smell of a medieval feast long enough to appreciate it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push through the heavy oak doors of the Chateau de Fontainebleau in 1533, and the assault on your senses nearly knocks you backward. The great hall reeks of sweat, wet dog, and rotting meat scraps ground into the rush-covered floor. French nobles sprawl across benches, tearing at roasted peacocks with their fingers, juice dripping down silk doublets that cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. A duchess beside you blows her nose directly onto the tablecloth, a perfectly acceptable practice that would horrify anyone from your century. You watch in fascination as a count reaches across three other diners, his sleeve dragging through multiple sauce bowls to grab a whole roasted capon. He tears off a leg with his teeth, spits out a piece of gristle onto his neighbor's plate, and laughs uproariously at his own crude joke about the bishop's mistress. This is the height of French sophistication in the early 1500s, where the only dining rule seems to be grab what you can before someone else does. The communal nature of eating shocks your modern sensibilities. Everyone drinks from the same cup, passing it mouth to mouth around the table, a detail that makes you grateful for germ theory. Historians still argue whether the average life expectancy of 35 had more to do with warfare or shared drinking vessels. You notice servants occasionally dumping buckets of fresh rushes over the worst spills on the floor, where a pack of hunting dogs fights over discarded bones and the occasional dropped pastry. A trumpet fanfare announces the arrival of the soup course, carried in a single enormous cauldron. Diners produce their own spoons from belt pouches. At least spoons exist. You think gratefully and lean in simultaneously, creating a chaotic scramble of elbows and burned tongues. One elderly duke accidentally dunks his long beard into the pot, and rather than being embarrassed, he simply wrings it out over his bread trencher, while others applaud his resourcefulness. You're startled when the gentleman next to you casually uses the hanging tapestry to wipe his mouth, leaving a dark stain on a priceless hunting scene. But no one bats an eye. This is standard practice. The mainstream historical fact that medieval nobles considered tablecloths a luxury item suddenly makes sense when you realize they served primarily as communal napkins. The quirky tidbit that some castles employed official tablecloth changers who swapped out soiled linens between every course seems less extravagant and more like basic hygiene. The noise level resembles a modern sports bar more than a refined dining experience. Knights shout wagers across the hall, challenge each other to drinking contests, and occasionally break into impromptu wrestling matches between courses. You dodge a flying turkey leg. Apparently, throwing food at jesters for entertainment is considered the height of wit. The formal dinner prayer that opened the meal feels like it happened in a different universe entirely. As you settle in to observe this controlled chaos, trying not to gag at the gentleman, gnawing marrow from a bone with disturbing enthusiasm, you can't help but wonder how French dining transformed from this animalistic free for all into the pinnacle of refined etiquette. The answer, you'll soon discover, arrives in the form of a 14-year-old Italian girl who's about to marry into this mess and decides she's having absolutely none of it. You shift your attention to the harbor at Marseille on a crisp October morning in 1533, where an ornate Italian galley drops anchor amid much fanfare. The ship bears the Medici coat of arms, those famous 6 red balls that represent either medical pills or Byzantine coins, depending on which historian's debate you believe. From the gleaming deck emerges Catherine de' Medici, and your first thought is how impossibly young she looks. At 14, she's barely a teenager by your standards, yet she carries herself with the calculated poise of someone who survived Italian Renaissance politics, which, frankly, makes medieval French dining look civilized. You follow her procession through the cheering crowds, noting how her dark Italian features stand out among the fairer French courtiers who've come to gawk at their future queen. She's not conventionally beautiful, even contemporary accounts admit this, but there's something unsettling about her intelligent black eyes that seem to catalog every detail. Behind her trails an enormous retinue of Italian servants, musicians, perfumers, and most importantly for our story, her personal cooking staff and dining attendants. The French nobles snicker behind their hands at her entourage. Typical Italian excess, you hear one duchess mutter, not realizing she's criticizing the very people who'll revolutionize her barbaric eating habits. You notice Catherine's lips tighten almost imperceptibly. She understands more French than anyone realizes. This calculated multilingualism will serve her well in the snake pit of French court politics. You watch Catherine's first French banquet that evening, and the culture shock on her face is palpable despite her diplomatic smile. When a duke reaches past her to grab meat with his bare hands, her nostril flare is so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't watching closely. She delicately produces a small 2-pronged fork from her dining set, a utensil that makes the French courtiers freeze mid-chew. The silence that falls over the nearby diners is deafening. "What is that instrument?" asks the Duchess of Bourbon, pronouncing instrument like one might say witchcraft. Catherine explains in accented French that it's a fork, common in Italian courts for eating. The reaction is immediate and hostile. You hear whispers of devil's tool and Eastern decadence ripple through the hall. One bishop actually crosses himself. The mainstream historical fact that the Catholic Church initially condemned forks as an affront to God, who gave us perfectly good fingers, suddenly feels very real and very absurd. But Catherine isn't just any Italian import. She's a Medici, raised by nuns, who ironically taught her that cleanliness was indeed next to godliness. then polished by the most sophisticated court in Europe. You observe her eating with precise, economical movements, never touching food with her hands except for bread. Her Italian attendants mirror her actions, creating an island of civilization in the sea of French chaos. It's like watching time travelers from the future try to blend in with cavemen. The political marriage to Henri, Duke of Orleans, is purely strategic, uniting French and Italian interests through her substantial dowry and his royal blood. But you can see Catherine's mind working as she observes the French court's dining habits. This isn't just about personal disgust, it's about power. In Renaissance Italy, she learned that controlling social customs means controlling people. Every time a French noble wipes greasy fingers on priceless silk, she sees an opportunity. You notice her making mental notes when the Count of Toulouse accidentally stabs the Marquis of Normandy while gesticulating with his eating knife during an animated story about hunting boar. The subsequent fistfight that breaks out over whether it was intentional has to be broken up by the royal guards. Catherine's slight smile suggests she's already planning knife etiquette reforms. Her husband Henri barely acknowledges her existence, too infatuated with his mistress Diane de Poitiers, who's old enough to be his mother. This public humiliation would crush a weaker spirit. But you see Catherine channeling her fury into observation. She studies the power dynamics at play during meals, who sits where, who serves whom, who gets the choicest cuts of meat. In Italy, these hierarchies were rigidly codified. In France, it's barely controlled chaos where might makes right. The quirky historical tidbit that Catherine brought her own ice cream makers from Italy seems less frivolous when you realize food innovation was her first form of soft power. While French nobles mock her frozen desserts as another Italian oddity, their children beg for tastes. Within months, you know she'll have the whole court addicted to gelato, proving that controlling what people crave gives you control over the people themselves. As the disastrous first banquet concludes, with two nobles vomiting from overindulgence and a small fire when someone knocks over a candelabra during a drunken toast, Catherine maintains her serene smile, but you catch her whispering to her Italian major domo in rapid Florentine dialect. Though you don't speak Italian, her tone suggests she's planning nothing short of a dining revolution. The French court has no idea they've just imported their own cultural colonizer. You find yourself in Catherine's private chambers 6 months later, where she unveils her secret weapon to a small gathering of curious ladies-in-waiting. The silver fork gleams in the candlelight as she demonstrates its use on a piece of candied fruit. You see, she explains with practiced patience, you never risk staining your sleeves or burning your fingers. The younger women lean forward, intrigued, while the older ones exchange skeptical glances that could curdle fresh cream. The first public fork incident explodes at a state dinner honoring the Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador. You watch Catherine deliberately, almost provocatively, use her fork throughout the meal. The ambassador, a German who's seen Italian customs, nods approvingly. But the French reaction is volcanic. The Bishop of Paris actually stands up mid-meal to denounce this blasphemous instrument that suggests God's hands are insufficient. Catherine continues eating, each delicate bite an act of rebellion. You overhear the kitchen staff gossiping later that night. She's a witch, insists the head cook. No proper Christian needs such devices. Next, she'll want us to eat with tiny pitchforks, like demons in hell. The irony that they're literally covered in food stains while criticizing cleanliness isn't lost on you. But fear of the foreign runs deep, and Catherine's fork has become a lightning rod for every anxiety about Italian influence at court. The fork controversy reaches absurd heights when a group of conservative nobles formally petition King Francis I to ban Italian eating implements from royal gatherings. You're present when they make their case, arguing that forks are effeminate, unnatural, and a gateway to moral decay. One baron dramatically claims he witnessed a man choked to death in Venice because he was too focused on his fork technique to properly chew, and historians still argue whether this story was complete fabrication or based on a real incident involving an olive pit. Catherine responds with characteristic cunning. Rather than confront the opposition directly, she begins hosting intimate Italian-style dinners in her quarters. You attend one of these exclusive gatherings where she serves delicate foods that are nearly impossible to eat gracefully without utensils, slippery pasta and cream sauce, oil-dressed salads, honey-glazed fruits. Her French guests struggle comically with their fingers while her Italian ladies eat with effortless elegance using forks. The turning point comes when Diane de Poitiers, Henri's powerful mistress and Catherine's chief rival, burns her fingers on a hot meat pie at a public banquet. You watch Catherine glide over, offering her personal fork with exaggerated concern. Please, madame, allow me to help prevent further injury. And the power play is brilliant. Diane can't refuse without appearing weak, but accepting means endorsing the despised Italian custom. She takes the fork with gritted teeth. Young courtiers, always eager for the next trend, begin commissioning their own forks from Italian craftsmen. You notice the palace blacksmith suddenly very busy with mysterious, small-pronged instruments. The quirky historical detail that early fork designs ranged from 2 to 5 prongs because no one could agree on the optimal number results in some hilarious dining attempts. You witness one dandy impale his own lip with an overly sharp 4-pronged model. Catherine cleverly links fork use to medical benefits, bringing in Italian physicians to explain how shared eating practices spread disease. After a nasty outbreak of what you recognize as probably strep throat races through court, her one person, one utensil message gains traction. The mainstream fact that medieval medicine blamed most illnesses on bad air makes her germ theory adjacent arguments seem revolutionary. The church's resistance crumbles when Catherine donates a set of golden forks to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, inscribed with biblical verses about cleanliness. Your modern sensibilities appreciate the irony of using religion to defeat religious objections. She also starts gifting ornate forks to powerful nobles' children, knowing that once the next generation embraces them, the practice becomes unstoppable. You're amazed by the underground fork market that develops. Servants whisper about secret fork training sessions where nobles practice proper technique to avoid embarrassment. One countess reportedly hired an Italian tutor specifically for utensil instruction. The same aristocrats who publicly denounce forks are privately desperate to master them before they become mandatory. The decisive moment arrives at the wedding feast of Catherine's eldest daughter. Every place setting features a complete set of Italian utensils, and Catherine announces that fork use is now expected at all royal functions. You scan the room as French nobles fumble with the unfamiliar implements, too proud to admit difficulty. One elderly duke stabs himself in the cheek. A young baroness flings sauce across the table, and the Marquis de Toulouse somehow manages to launch a quail egg into the Duchess beside him's elaborate hairpiece. But they all keep trying, because the alternative, being seen as unsophisticated, is socially catastrophic. Catherine observes from the high table, fork moving with practiced grace, having transformed a simple eating implement into a tool of cultural dominance. The devil's instrument has become civilization's requirement, and every bite taken with a fork cements her soft power over French society. You notice the shift beginning at a summer feast in 1547 when Catherine produces a square of pristine white linen from her sleeve and delicately dabs her lips. The gesture seems unremarkable to your modern eyes, but the French nobles stare like she's just performed a magic trick. Until now, you've watched them use everything from their sleeves to the tablecloth to the backs of their hands, or more commonly, simply letting sauce dry in their beards like some sort of masculine badge of honor. The napkin revolution starts quietly in Catherine's private chambers, where her Italian seamstresses work on what seems like an endless supply of fine linen squares. You examine their handiwork, each napkin embroidered with delicate patterns, some featuring the Medici arms, others decorated with French fleur-de-lis in a diplomatic nod to her adopted homeland. The mainstream historical fact that napkins originally started as shared communal cloths in ancient Rome makes Catherine's individual napkin concept seem almost radical by comparison. You're present when she introduces personal napkins at a state banquet, placing one at each setting like tiny flags of surrender to civilization. The Duke of Burgundy picks his up suspiciously, as if it might bite. "What is this meant for?" he demands. Catherine demonstrates, unfolding hers with theatrical precision and laying it across her lap. The collective gasp from the French nobility suggests she might as well have stripped naked. The resistance is immediate and creative. You watch one baron ostentatiously blow his nose into his napkin, then hand it to a servant with exaggerated disgust. Another uses his to clean his boots under the table. The Countess of Anjou accidentally drops hers in the gravy boat, but Catherine remains unruffled, replacing soiled napkins with fresh ones throughout the meal, her Italian servants moving like a well-orchestrated napkin brigade. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source: fashion. When Catherine starts wearing increasingly elaborate and expensive gowns to dinner, her ladies-in-waiting realize that napkins protect their own costly garments from stains. You observe the economic calculation flickering across their faces. One napkin costs far less than replacing a ruined silk dress. Suddenly, requesting a napkin becomes a sign of wealth. Only someone with expensive clothes would need to protect them. Catherine exploits this vanity brilliantly. She commissions napkins in different sizes and qualities, creating an entire hierarchy of table linens. The quirky historical tidbit that Renaissance napkins could measure up to 35 inches square, large enough to cover an entire outfit, makes sense when you see nobles trying to protect every inch of their elaborate court dress. Some napkins become so ornate they're essentially portable tapestries. You attend a dinner where Catherine introduces napkin etiquette rules that seem bizarre even by Renaissance standards. Napkins must be placed on the left, never the right. They should be unfolded with both hands, never shaken out. Used napkins must be left slightly crumpled. Folding them implies you think the host's linens are too dirty to touch. One young courtier takes notes, creating what might be history's first napkin instruction manual. The napkin evolves from practical tool to social weapon. You witness Catherine pointedly not providing napkins for nobles who've opposed her other reforms, forcing them to eat with conspicuous care or risk public humiliation. One duchess, denied a napkin, tries to eat soup with such caution that she barely manages 3 spoonfuls in an hour. The message is clear. Embrace Catherine's civilizing mission or starve with dignity. Servants face their own napkin crisis. Who washes these hundreds of personal linens? How do you return the right napkin to the right noble? You follow a harried laundress trying to decipher embroidered monograms, muttering prayers that she doesn't accidentally give the cardinal's napkin to his sworn enemy. The logistics of individual napkins create entire new palace positions, napkin folders, napkin guards, even a master of the napkin ceremony. The church, still smarting from their fork defeat, attempts to rally against napkins as symbols of prideful vanity, but Catherine counters by commissioning a series of napkins embroidered with religious scenes, turning them into portable prayer cloths. Historians still argue whether her Stations of the Cross napkin set was genuine piety or brilliant political maneuvering. You suspect it's both. Catherine that never does anything for just one reason. Children become unexpected napkin ambassadors. You watch Catherine personally teaching young nobles proper napkin use, making it a game where points are awarded for the cleanest face after each course. Parents who initially scoffed at Italian frippery suddenly beg for napkin lessons when their children return home refusing to eat like barbarians. One 8-year-old heir to a duchy announces he won't dine with his parents until they learn to use proper linens like civilized people. By winter, napkin use has spread beyond the palace. Wealthy merchants commission their own sets, complete with family crests. You spot Parisian shops selling Catherine-style dining linens at astronomical prices. The same nobles who threw napkins in gravy boats 6 months ago now compete over who has the finest, largest, most elaborately decorated collection. The Marquis de Toulouse boasts of owning over 500 napkins, though you notice he still occasionally wipes his mouth on his sleeve when he thinks no one's looking. The transformation is so complete that when a visiting English diplomat arrives without knowledge of napkin etiquette, The French court reacts with the same horror they once reserved for forks. You realize Catherine has successfully made the French feel superior about an Italian custom they initially rejected, a psychological victory that would impress modern marketing executives. You enter the grand dining hall at Fontainebleau to find chaos of an entirely different sort than the food-flinging melees of previous years. Catherine stands at the center, directing servants who scurry about with measuring strings and chalk, marking precise positions on the floor. The great tables, which usually sprawl haphazardly wherever space allows, are being arranged in a rigid horseshoe pattern that makes the nobles clustering in the doorway mutter nervously about Italian sorcery. The seating chart Catherine unveils looks like a battle plan, which, you realize, is exactly what it is. Every name is positioned according to a complex algorithm of rank, favor, political alliance, and personal vendetta. You watch her deliberately place the Duke of Guise, who publicly called her the Italian merchant's daughter, at the far end of the lowest table, a social death sentence that makes him turn purple with rage. Meanwhile, minor nobles who supported her reforms find themselves mysteriously elevated to positions near the royal dais. You're present for the first dinner under the new seating regime, and the tension could be carved with one of Catherine's controversial forks. Nobles who've sat wherever they pleased for decades suddenly find themselves assigned specific spots like school children. The Count of Artois discovers he's been placed below a recently ennobled banker who reported Catherine's napkin initiative. His protest that his family fought at Agincourt falls on deaf ears in Catherine's dining hall. Medieval military glory matters less than modern table manners. The mainstream historical fact that Renaissance seating arrangements could literally spark duels becomes viscerally real when the Marquis de Soissons finds himself seated below the salt, the massive ceremonial salt cellar that divides the worthy from the less worthy. He actually reaches for his sword before remembering that Catherine has also banned weapons from the dining hall. You notice the irony. She's civilized French dining to the point where nobles can no longer murder each other over perceived slights at dinner. Catherine introduces place cards, another Italian innovation that sends shockwaves through the court. These aren't just names scrawled on parchment, but elaborate mini portraits. Each guest's card decorated with symbols of their achievements or failures. The quirky historical detail that some nobles hired artists specifically to design flattering place cards seems less absurd when you see the Duchess of Orleans burst into tears because her card features a rather unflattering caricature that emphasizes her prominent nose. The power plays are delicious to observe. Catherine seats bitter enemies directly across from each other, forcing them to maintain civility or risk her displeasure. She places potential romantic matches strategically close, engineering courtships that serve her political purposes. You watch one young countess realize she's been seated next to an elderly widower with vast estates, her mother's excitement barely contained behind her napkin. Protocol multiplies exponentially. Who enters the hall first? Who sits first? Who can speak to whom across the careful geographic boundaries Catherine has created? You witness a traffic jam of nobles in the doorway, each terrified of entering in the wrong order. A helpful Italian master of ceremonies attempts to direct traffic but nearly causes a riot when he suggests a duke should follow a marquis. Historians still argue whether Catherine deliberately created this chaos to keep the nobility too focused on etiquette to plot against her. The enforcement mechanisms are brilliantly subtle. Servants accidentally serve courses out of order to nobles who sit in the wrong seats. Wine mysteriously runs out at tables where guests have rearranged themselves. You observe one rebellious baron who insists on sitting in his traditional spot, find his meat courses consistently arrive cold, his wine watered, his napkin somehow always damp. After 3 dinners of this treatment, he meekly takes his assigned seat. Catherine uses the seating chart as a real-time political barometer. You notice positions shifting nightly based on court intrigue. Support her latest reform. Move up 2 seats. Question her Italian advisors. Enjoy your view from behind a pillar. The dining hall becomes a stock exchange of social currency where proximity to power is literally measured in inches from the royal table. Children present a particular challenge. Traditional French custom allowed noble offspring to run wild during feasts, but Catherine assigns them to a separate children's table, another shocking innovation. You watch tiny aristocrats, some barely 5 years old, struggling with the complex etiquette their parents are still learning. One precocious 6-year-old daughter of a duke solemnly informs her father he's holding his napkin wrong, a reversal of authority that would have been unthinkable months ago. The psychological warfare extends to table decorations. Centerpieces, coincidentally, block sight lines between enemies. Candelabras create shadows that obscure disfavored nobles while spotlighting Catherine's allies. You realize she's essentially invented mood lighting as a political tool. The Count of Provence, seated in perpetual shadow, eventually offers a massive donation to Catherine's latest building project and miraculously finds himself relocated to a beautifully illuminated spot the next evening. Foreign ambassadors require special consideration, leading to what you recognize as the birth of diplomatic protocol. Where do you seat the Spanish ambassador relative to the English one when their countries are technically at war? Catherine solves this by creating a separate international table where different rules apply, a political innovation that will echo through centuries of state dinners. The fact that she seats herself close enough to eavesdrop on their conversations is surely coincidental. By the season's end, Catherine's arrangement has become synonymous with proper order itself. French nobles start applying seating hierarchies to their own provincial courts, spreading her system throughout France. You overhear one duchess planning her daughter's wedding feast with more attention to seating than to the actual ceremony. The rigid social geography Catherine imposed on dining halls becomes the template for French society itself, proof that controlling where people sit means controlling where they stand. You watch the servant's hands tremble as he sets down a revolutionary object at each place setting, an individual plate, pristine white ceramic imported from Catherine's Italian suppliers. The collective intake of breath from the assembled nobles sounds like wind through a cathedral. Until this moment, You've observed them eating from shared platters, bread trenchers, or directly off the table itself. The concept of personal dining space is about to shatter their communal world. The Duke of Bourbon picks up his plate and examines it like an archaeological artifact. Are we so diseased that we cannot share as Christians should? He demands, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. Catherine responds with practiced calm, explaining that individual plates prevent the spread of illness and ensure each guest receives equal portions. You catch the subtle dig. French nobles have been literally fighting over food like dogs, and now she's treating them as such by giving them separate bowls. You notice the immediate practical problems. Servants trained to deposit entire roasted animals on communal platters now struggle with the mathematics of individual portions. The head cook storms through the kitchen, screaming about how to divide a peacock into 47 equal parts. One harried server accidentally gives the bishop twice as much swan as the count beside him, nearly triggering a theological debate about gluttony. The psychological impact proves even more dramatic. You observe nobles suddenly self-conscious about their portions, comparing plate contents with paranoid intensity. The Countess of Anjou convinces herself that her smaller lamb portion indicates Catherine's displeasure. The Marquis de Toulouse measures his neighbor's fish with a piece of string he produces from his doublet. What began as a hygiene measure has transformed into a complex social calculator. Catherine exploits the individual plate system to enforce her expanding etiquette rules. You watch her demonstrate proper plate placement, one hand's width from the table edge, aligned with mathematical precision. Plates must remain in position throughout the meal. Moving them is now a breach of protocol. One elderly duke, accustomed to pulling platters closer, finds his plate mysteriously glued to the tablecloth after repeatedly repositioning it. The mainstream historical fact that medieval diners often ate from trenchers, stale bread slices that absorb juices, makes the transition to ceramic plates culturally seismic. Beggars who traditionally received the gravy-soaked bread after feasts suddenly find their food source eliminated. Catherine cleverly solves this by establishing a separate kitchen for the poor, turning potential resentment into gratitude while further cementing her control over food distribution. You attend a dinner where Catherine introduces the concept of courses served on fresh plates, another mind-bending innovation. French nobles stare in horror as servants remove their barely used plates between soup and meat. Wasteful Italian excess, hisses the Duchess of Berry, not grasping that plates will be washed rather than discarded. The logistics overwhelm the kitchen staff. You count over 400 individual plates used for a single meal, each requiring washing, drying, and careful storage. The plate hierarchy that develops fascinates your modern sensibilities. Catherine assigns plates of different sizes, materials, and decorations based on rank. The quirky historical tidbit that some nobles began bringing their own plates to dinner, trusting neither Catherine's hygiene nor her portion control, results in a competitive arms race of increasingly elaborate personal dinnerware. The Duke of Orleans appears with a golden plate, so heavy his servant must help him lift it. Individual plates create unexpected social crises. When dining partners can no longer share food as a sign of friendship or romance, new gestures must be invented. You watch young courtiers struggle to express affection without the traditional sharing of trenchers. One creative suitor arranges his P's into his beloved's initials, starting a trend of plate messages that Catherine will eventually ban for encouraging playing with food. The resistance movement takes creative forms. A group of conservative nobles host a traditional feast where they ostentatiously eat from communal platters, describing it as a return to true French values. Catherine responds by having her servants loudly discuss a recent outbreak of mysterious illness among the traditionalists, heavily implying their communal eating caused it. Whether true or manufactured, the rumor effectively ends the rebellion. Children adapt fastest, as always. You observe Catherine's dining school for young nobles, where 6-year-olds practice eating from their own plates with the seriousness of military drills. One precocious child explains to his grandfather that sharing plates is what peasants do, a reversal of social assumptions that makes the old man sputter into his wine. Within a generation, communal eating will seem as archaic as going unwashed. The economic impact ripples outward. Pottery workshops across France pivot to producing individual plates, creating a new industry. Italian ceramic merchants grow wealthy overnight. You notice servants developing specialized skills, plate arrangers, portion specialists, even a master of plate symmetry who ensures each table setting matches perfectly. The French economy is literally being reshaped by Catherine's dining revolution. By winter, you witness the complete transformation. The same nobles who protested individual plates now panic if their personal dinnerware isn't properly positioned. The Count of Artois actually measures the distance between his plate and his neighbor's, complaining about a quarter-inch discrepancy. Catherine observes from her perfectly set place at the high table, having successfully transformed another basic human activity into a complex ritual under her absolute control. The communal chaos of medieval dining has been replaced by individualized order, each plate a small kingdom with borders as rigid as any nation's. You feel the tension in the dining hall ratchet up several notches as Catherine stands to address her assembled nobles before the evening feast. In her hand, she holds an ornate eating knife, its point gleaming ominously in the candlelight. From this day forward, she announces, all knives at royal tables shall have rounded tips, and pointing any blade at another diner will be considered an act of aggression against the crown. The murmur of outrage that ripples through the room sounds like a gathering storm. The Duke of Nemours immediately protests, producing his own ancestral eating knife, a wicked 6-inch blade he inherited from his grandfather, who probably used it for both dining and dueling. This blade has carved meat at French tables for 5 generations, he thunders. Catherine smiles sweetly and suggests perhaps it's time for French nobility to evolve beyond their ancestors who couldn't distinguish between dinner and warfare. You notice her guards have positioned themselves strategically around the room. You observe the first meal under the new knife rules and its barely controlled chaos. Nobles accustomed to spearing food with knife points now struggle with blunted implements. The Count of Toulouse attempts to skewer a piece of beef, fails, and watches it shoot across the table into the Duchess of Orleans' décolletage. She screams. He reaches to help, remembers he's holding a knife, and freezes in social paralysis. Even blunted, a knife pointed at a duchess's chest is politically problematic. The prohibition against pointing creates an elaborate dance of angles and positions. You watch diners contort themselves to avoid any gesture that might direct a knife tip toward another person. One baron, enthusiastically describing a boar hunt, accidentally aims his knife at the bishop beside him and immediately drops to his knees begging forgiveness. The bishop, still holding his own knife, can't figure out how to make a blessing gesture without potentially threatening someone. Catherine introduces a complex system of knife placement between courses. Blades must face inward toward the plate. Facing outward suggests hostile intentions. Knives should rest at precise angles that you realize correspond to clock positions. The mainstream historical fact that medieval nobles often carried personal knives for all purposes makes Catherine's specialized dining knives seem almost effeminate to warriors who've used the same blade to hunt, fight, and eat. The knife sharpening industry collapses overnight. You follow a previously prosperous blade merchant who specialized in keeping nobles eating knives razor sharp, now trying to pivot to gentle dining implements. He shows you his new rounded designs with the morose air of a weapons maker forced to manufacture toys. The quirky historical detail that some nobles tried to maintain sharp knives by claiming religious exemptions. They needed points to properly test their food for poison, leads to theological debates about whether God intended knives to be sharp. You're present when the first knife crime occurs at court. The Marquis de Soubise, deep in his cups, forgets the new rules and gesticulates wildly with his knife while telling a war story. The pointed blade, he's still using an old-style knife, passes within inches of Catherine's face. The hall goes silent. Guards move in. The Marquis sobers instantly, realizing he's just committed what amounts to attempted regicide. Catherine lets him sweat for a long moment before graciously accepting his apology for his unfortunate gesture. The social dynamics shift dramatically. Without knife points for emphasis, nobles must find new ways to dominate dinner conversation. You notice an increased volume, more elaborate hand gestures, sans utensils, and competitive storytelling that doesn't require props. One creative baron brings a small wooden pointer specifically for gesticulating, arguing it technically isn't a knife. Catherine allows it briefly before banning all pointing implements except fingers from the dining hall. Training young nobles in proper knife etiquette becomes a martial art. You observe Catherine's dining master, an imported Italian, naturally, teaching children to cut meat with rounded knives. It requires a sawing motion rather than stabbing. Completely different muscle memory. One frustrated 8-year-old heir complains that eating has become harder than sword fighting lessons. His instructor agrees, but notes that more nobles die from dinner disputes than battlefield wounds these days. The knife rebellion takes subtle forms. Some nobles commission knives with rounded tips that telescope into points for hunting purposes only. Others carry multiple knives, switching to pointed versions when Catherine isn't watching. You spot one elderly duke who's filed a groove in his rounded knife, creating a pseudo point that technically complies while spiritually violating the rules. Catherine responds by instituting knife inspections before state dinners. Foreign ambassadors struggle with the new protocols. The Spanish ambassador, from a court where knife displays indicate status, finds himself essentially castrated at French dinners. The English delegation brings their own pointed knives, claiming diplomatic immunity. Catherine solves this by creating different colored knives for foreigners, blunted but distinctively marked, so everyone knows they're not bound by French civilization. Historians still argue whether this was accommodation or subtle humiliation. The unexpected consequence is a reduction in dinner violence by roughly 80%, according to the palace physician's records you examine. Wounds from dining accidents drop from multiple incidents weekly to almost none. The physician notes wryly that he misses the income, but appreciates eating dinner without being called away to stitch up nobles who've stabbed each other over the proper interpretation of Aristotle. By the year's end, rounded knives have become a status symbol. Nobles compete over who has the most elaborately decorated blunt knives, with handles of ivory, gold, and precious gems. The same warriors who protested the emasculation of their blades now boast about their Catherine-approved knife collections. You overhear the Duke of Bourbon, who led the initial resistance, explaining to a visiting German prince that pointed knives are barbaric implements unfit for civilized French tables. Catherine's revolution is complete when the revolutionaries forget they ever lived differently. You watch Catherine unveil her latest innovation with the theatrical flair of a magician revealing an impossible trick. Servants enter bearing trays of delicate Venetian glassware, each piece catching the light like captured rainbows. The French nobles, accustomed to sharing thick metal tankards or leather drinking vessels, stare at these transparent creations as if they're supernatural objects. The Duke of Anjou actually reaches out to touch one, then withdraws his hand, afraid it might shatter from mere proximity. The first attempt at wine service under the new regime is a disaster of epic proportions. You count 17 broken glasses in the first hour alone. French nobles, used to gripping heavy tankards with battlefield strength, crush the delicate stems like twigs. The Countess of Blois watches in horror as her glass simply explodes in her hand, covering her new Italian silk gown in burgundy wine. The tinkling cascade of breaking glass becomes the evening's soundtrack. Catherine patiently explains that individual glasses prevent the spread of disease, no more passing the communal cup mouth to mouth around the table. The Bishop of Lyon objects that sharing wine is a sacred act of communion. Catherine counters that Christ shared wine with 12 disciples, not 1,200 courtiers with questionable oral hygiene. You notice several nobles unconsciously touching their lips, suddenly aware of their own potential contamination. The psychological impact of transparent drinking vessels proves profound. For the first time, Everyone can see exactly how much others are drinking. You observe the Count of Toulouse, notorious for his wine consumption, suddenly nursing a single glass all evening. The ability to monitor consumption transforms drinking from a private vice to a public performance. The quirky historical detail that some nobles initially believed transparent glass would reveal poison leads to several embarrassing incidents of courtiers holding their glasses up to candles, searching for suspicious particles. Catherine introduces rules about proper glass holding that would make a modern sommelier weep with joy. Stems must be gripped between thumb and two fingers, never the bowl. Glasses should be lifted, not slid across the table. Toasting requires specific angles to avoid glass on glass violence. You watch her Italian wine master demonstrate proper technique, while French nobles take notes like university students, their warrior hands struggling with delicate precision. The economic transformation is immediate. Italian glassmakers can't keep up with demand. You follow one Venetian merchant who arrives with a single crate of glasses and leaves with enough gold to buy a palazzo. French glassmakers scramble to learn Italian techniques, producing hilariously inferior products. One Norman craftsman's attempt at delicate stemware looks more like a club with a bowl attached. Catherine politely uses these French glasses for water service, a subtle insult everyone understands. You're present for the great wine glass crisis of 1548, when a shortage of Venetian imports nearly causes a diplomatic incident. Nobles who've grown accustomed to individual glasses revolt at the suggestion of sharing. The Marquis de Soissons actually brings his own glass from home, cradling it like a baby. Catherine solves the crisis by introducing a glass hierarchy: crystal for high nobility, clear glass for minor nobles, colored glass for wealthy merchants. The mainstream historical fact that glass color often hid the poor quality of medieval wine becomes irrelevant when everyone can see exactly what they're drinking. The disposal of broken glasses creates unexpected protocol. Should servants sweep shards immediately, disrupting dinner, or leave them as crunching hazards? You witness one elderly duchess step on broken glass, her shriek interrupting the cardinal mid-prayer. Catherine establishes a corps of silent glass sweepers who glide through the hall like ghosts, somehow removing hazards without anyone noticing. Their training involves cleaning up staged breakages while balanced on one foot, a skill that seems absurd until you see it save numerous silk slippers. Children face particular challenges with the new glassware. You observe a glass training session where young nobles practice with wooden replicas before graduating to actual glass. One 7-year-old successfully drinks from crystal for the first time and receives applause usually reserved for military victories. His younger sister, jealous of the attention, deliberately drops her glass, learning that breaking Catherine's rules brings swift banishment to the nursery. The wine itself transforms under glass scrutiny. Suddenly visible sediment, color variations, and clarity matter. Wine merchants who've been passing off inferior products find their deceptions literally transparent. You notice Catherine's wine steward conducting what amounts to quality control, rejecting barrels that would have been acceptable when hidden in opaque vessels. The French wine industry begins its evolution toward quality over quantity, driven by the simple innovation of being able to see what you're drinking. Social drinking rituals evolve to accommodate fragile glassware. The hearty clashing of tankards is replaced by delicate, glass ringing toasts. You watch nobles develop increasingly elaborate toasting choreography to avoid collisions. One creative courtier invents the air toast, raising glasses toward each other without contact. Catherine approves, codifying it into yet another rule. The boisterous drinking songs that once accompanied communal tankard passing fade into memory, replaced by refined conversation that won't shake the table. By winter's end, the transformation is complete. The same nobles who crushed their first glasses now handle crystal with surgeon's precision. The Duke of Bourbon, whose initial glass-breaking record stood at 12 in one evening, hasn't broken one in months. You overhear him lecturing a visiting Spanish noble about the barbarism of communal drinking vessels. Catherine watches from her seat, sipping from an impossibly delicate glass that catches the light like liquid diamond. Having successfully transformed even the act of drinking into an exercise in controlled elegance. The heavy medieval tankard has given way to transparent refinement, and with it, another piece of the old world shatters as definitively as those first 17 glasses. You lean forward as Catherine rises between the meat and cheese courses, her voice cutting through the din with practiced authority. At civilized tables, she announces, conversation shall be as refined as our dining implements. Therefore, I present rules for proper dinner discourse. The scroll she unfurls might as well be a declaration of war against French conversational culture. The prohibition list is extensive. No discussions of death, disease, bodily functions, political executions, or the ever-popular topic of whose mistress is currently pregnant. The Count of Périgord immediately violates the new rules by launching into his favorite story about surviving the plague. Catherine's steward rings a small silver bell, the new signal for conversational violation. The Count stops mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. The silence that follows is excruciating. You realize Catherine has weaponized social awkwardness itself. You observe the first dinner under full conversation restrictions, and it's like watching actors who've forgotten their lines. French nobles, deprived of their standard topics, war stories, hunting accidents, court scandals, and various bodily ailments, struggle to fill the silence. The Duke of Vendôme attempts to discuss the weather, runs out of observations after it's rather mild, and subsides into desperate wine consumption. His dinner partner, equally lost, responds with 17 variations of indeed. Catherine provides approved conversation topics written on elegant cards placed at each setting. Art, music, philosophy, and classical literature top the list. You watch the Marquis de Maintenon squint at his card, mouth the word Aristotle, and look like he's been asked to explain alchemy. The mainstream historical fact that most French nobles were functionally illiterate makes Catherine's emphasis on literary discussion particularly cruel. She knows exactly what she's doing. The ban on discussing politics during meals creates spectacular tension. You're present when news arrives of a major military victory against the Spanish. The messenger bursts in, realizes he's interrupting dinner, and freezes. He can't announce political news, but his urgency is obvious. Catherine finally allows him to whisper to the king, who must pretend nothing significant has happened while practically vibrating with excitement. The entire court spends dessert in agony, forbidden from discussing what everyone knows must be momentous news. Religious conversation proves equally treacherous. The Bishop of Rheims begins explaining theological doctrine, forgetting that religion borders dangerously on politics in Reformation-era France. When he mentions Protestant heresy, Catherine's bell rings so forcefully it cracks. He pivots desperately to discussing church architecture, but even that leads to dangerous ground. Whose church is more magnificent implies whose faith is superior. The poor bishop ends up silently moving food around his plate like a scolded child. You notice Catherine's Italian courtiers smoothly filling conversational voids with discussions of art and poetry. They've been trained for this. One young Italian woman recites Petrarch between courses, her melodious voice making French nobles simultaneously enchanted and furious. The quirky historical detail that Catherine imported Italian conversation masters to teach proper dinner discourse seems less excessive when you watch French aristocrats literally taking notes on how to discuss nonviolent topics. The children's table becomes an unexpected training ground for new conversation standards. You observe young nobles practicing appropriate dinner topics with the seriousness of diplomatic negotiations. One 8-year-old corrects his father's attempt to discuss a recent bear hunt. Papa, hunting involves death. Would you prefer to discuss the musical qualities of the lute? The father's expression suggests he'd prefer discussing anything else, including his own execution. Silence becomes a strategic weapon. Some nobles, rather than risk bell-ringing humiliation, simply stop talking. Dinners begin to resemble Trappist monasteries until Catherine introduces another rule. Extended silence is also inappropriate, suggesting either social incompetence or silent judgment of companions. Now nobles must talk, but only about approved topics, creating a conversational minefield where every word risks detonation. The resistance takes creative forms. The Duke of Guise develops an elaborate code where discussing roses means military campaigns and weather indicates political intrigue. Catherine's spies quickly crack the code, leading to the absurd spectacle of the Duke earnestly discussing actual roses for an entire meal while his co-conspirators wait for hidden meanings that never come. Historians still argue whether he was genuinely interested in horticulture or playing an even deeper game. Foreign ambassadors struggle with conversation restrictions that seem to prohibit their entire job description. The English ambassador, forbidden from discussing politics at dinner, resorts to passing written notes under the table. When caught, he claims they're poetry verses, leading to the excruciating experience of him having to read his diplomatic dispatches aloud as if they were sonnets. The king's position on trade tariffs flows like a gentle stream, becomes the court's favorite accidental comedy. You witness the birth of what will become salon culture, Deprived of crude topics, some nobles actually develop intellectual interests. The Duchess of Montpensier, previously known mainly for her graphic descriptions of childbirth, discovers a genuine passion for astronomy. Her dinner conversation about celestial movements initially sounds forced, but gradually becomes fascinating. Other nobles begin competing to sound cultured, reading frantically between meals to prepare clever observations. The transformation crystallizes at a grand feast where an entire evening passes without a single bell ring. French nobles discuss art, music, and philosophy with apparent ease. Beneath the surface, you sense the effort. The Count of Armagnac grips his wine-glass so tightly it creaks when prevented from sharing his opinion on Protestant heretics. But they maintain the facade. Catherine surveys her work with satisfaction. She's taken French nobles who once discussed battlefield disembowelments over dinner and turned them into people who debate the merits of different sonnet forms. The fact that most of them secretly hate every minute doesn't matter. Civilization is often involuntary. You follow Catherine through the palace corridors to a room that sounds like a medieval torture chamber, but turns out to be something far more sinister, her children's dining academy. Inside, 24 noble offspring aged 5 to 12 sit at miniature tables, their backs rigid with terror as Italian instructors patrol between them like sergeants inspecting troops. A 6-year-old heir to a duchy silently weeps as he attempts to cut meat with a rounded knife for the dozenth time, his small hands cramping from the unfamiliar sawing motion. The head instructor, a severe Italian woman who could make a battle-hardened knight cry, demonstrates proper posture by balancing books on children's heads while they eat. You watch one girl, perhaps 7 years old, trying to bring a spoon to her mouth without disturbing the precariously balanced tome. Her concentration is so intense that sweat beads on her forehead. When the book finally tumbles into her soup, the instructor's disapproving cluck sounds like a death sentence. Catherine personally oversees napkin folding lessons, her patience with children noticeably thinner than with adults. The future of French civilization rests in your small hands, she tells a group of 8-year-olds struggling with linen origami. One boy suggests his servants could fold napkins for him. Catherine's smile could freeze blood. And when you dine with foreign princes who judge French sophistication by your table manners, the child has no answer, neither would you. The curriculum is brutal. You examine the daily schedule, 2 hours of utensil practice, 1 hour of posture training, 90 minutes of appropriate conversation, and an entire afternoon dedicated to the proper pace of eating. The mainstream historical fact that noble children traditionally ran wild during feasts, throwing food and crawling under tables, makes this regimented training seem like switching from anarchy to military school, which, you realize, is exactly Catherine's intention. Testing takes the form of formal dinners where children must demonstrate their skills before their horrified parents. You attend one such examination where a 9-year-old marquise's son must navigate a 7-course meal without a single etiquette violation. His mother grips her fan so tightly it snaps when he almost, but doesn't, lick his knife. The boy maintains perfect form throughout, even when served challenging foods like whole artichokes and snails, specifically chosen to test dexterity. The psychological pressure creates unexpected rebellions. You witness the great food fight of 1549 when a group of preteen nobles, pushed beyond their breaking point, stage a coordinated return to barbarism. They fling carefully cut meat portions, use tablecloths as capes, and drink from finger bowls. Catherine's response is swift and merciless. The ringleaders are sent home to their estates with letters detailing their inability to meet basic civilizational standards. For noble families, it's social death. You're amazed by the intensive fork training that resembles weapons instruction. Children practice spearing single peas for hours, developing muscle memory for precise movements. The quirky historical detail that some parents hired private fork tutors to give their children competitive advantages seems logical when you see the social consequences of poor technique. One duchess actually disowns her son temporarily after he drops his fork 3 times at a public dinner. The conversation training for children borders on the surreal. 5-year-olds memorize appropriate dinner topics while still learning basic speech. You observe a lesson where children practice discussing weather in classical Latin because Catherine insists truly civilized conversation should be multilingual. One precocious girl delivers a perfect observation about cloud formations in 3 languages, earning a rare nod of approval that she'll probably treasure forever. Gender differences in training fascinate you. Boys must unlearn aggressive eating habits inherited from warrior fathers, while girls face scrutiny over delicate consumption that borders on performance art. You watch instructors teaching young ladies to eat entire meals without once showing their teeth, a skill that requires the jaw control of a ventriloquist. Meanwhile, boys learn to cut meat without looking like they're preparing for battle, suppressing generations of martial instinct. The children's responses vary wildly. Some embrace the training with terrifying enthusiasm, becoming tiny etiquette tyrants who correct their elders. You witness one 8-year-old informing the king himself that his wine glass angle violates proper form. Others develop nervous conditions. The palace physician reports an epidemic of childhood stomach ailments he attributes to dining anxiety. Several children simply refuse to eat in public rather than risk humiliation. Parents face their own challenges. Mothers who can barely manage the new rules themselves must reinforce them at home. You follow one countess attempting to maintain Catherine's standards in her provincial castle, creating elaborate training meals while her husband rolls his eyes and sneaks food to the children when she's not looking. The mixed messages create a generation of nobles with split personalities, perfect at court, feral at home. The long-term implications become clear when you observe these trained children returning as teenagers. They move through state dinners with mechanical precision, every gesture programmed. But you notice the light has gone out of some eyes, the joy of communal eating replaced by anxiety over proper angles and approved topics. One young count confides that he hasn't enjoyed a meal since age 6, when eating became a performance rather than pleasure. Catherine judges her success by the numbers. Dining related incidents among young nobles drop to near zero. Foreign ambassadors report amazement at French children's table manners, comparing them favorably to adult behavior in their own courts. You overhear the Spanish ambassador marveling that a French 7-year-old has better etiquette than his own knights. What he doesn't see is that same child practicing fork positions in her sleep, tiny fingers moving through remembered motions like a pianist playing silent scales. You stumble upon the first sign of organized resistance in the palace kitchens, where a group of nobles huddle around a makeshift table, deliberately eating with their hands from a communal pot. The Duke of Montmorency, his face greasy with lamb fat, raises a turkey leg like a battle standard. To hell with the Italian she-devil's rules, he declares, and his conspirators cheer through mouths full of unchewed meat. This is the society of the free table, and their rebellion is deliciously, disgustingly literal. The resistance takes increasingly creative forms. You attend a traditional French feast, hosted in the palace stables, technically not under Catherine's dining room jurisdiction. Nobles sprawl on hay bales, passing wineskins and tearing at roasted boar with theatrical barbarism. The Count of Nevers has actually grown out his fingernails specifically for meat-tearing purposes. They've appointed a Lord of Misrule, whose job is to violate every one of Catherine's regulations in the most flamboyant way possible. Catherine's response is brilliantly indirect. Rather than acknowledge the rebellion, she begins hosting competing events at the same time, featuring entertainment and delicacies available only to those who follow proper etiquette. You watch rebels sneak glances toward the palace windows, where music and laughter drift out, their defiant chewing gradually losing enthusiasm. The Duchess of Alençon finally cracks, abandoning her turkey leg mid-bite to race back to civilization and dancing. The satirical performances become the rebellion's most effective weapon. Court jesters develop routines mocking elaborate dining rituals, exaggerating napkin folding into origami ceremonies that require 3 servants and a mathematics degree. One particularly brave fool performs the dance of the 47 forks, juggling utensils while reciting Catherine's rules in a mock Italian accent. The audience roars with laughter until Catherine appears, watching the entire performance with an unreadable smile that terrifies everyone into silence. You discover underground etiquette schools where rebels teach counter manners, elaborate parodies of Catherine's system. Students learn to hold forks with their feet, cut meat blindfolded, and conduct entire conversations using only words that rhyme with napkin. The absurdity highlights the arbitrary nature of Catherine's rules, though you notice even rebels unconsciously follow some protocols. They mock proper posture while sitting correctly, ridicule napkin placement while using napkins at all. The church becomes an unexpected ally to the resistance. Several bishops declare Catherine's dining reforms prideful vanity that distracts from spiritual contemplation. They host humble feasts where nobles eat simple bread and water while discussing theology, conveniently forgetting to mention the elaborate wine and meat courses that follow prayers. The quirky historical detail that some monasteries began producing etiquette violation indulgences seems like satire until you see nobles actually purchasing forgiveness for using the wrong fork. Children of rebels face impossible choices. You observe young nobles torn between their parents' defiance and Catherine's training academy. One 12-year-old duke's son develops a peculiar condition where he eats perfectly at court, but becomes physically ill attempting to use utensils at home. His father's traditional feasts trigger anxiety attacks. The palace physician coins the term dining dysphoria for children caught between two incompatible eating cultures. The resistance infiltrates Catherine's own staff. You catch Italian servants secretly teaching French nobles how to appear compliant while subtly violating rules, holding forks at technically correct but slightly mocking angles, following conversation restrictions while loading every approved topic with double meanings. One Italian etiquette master actually runs a midnight consulting service, teaching creative interpretations that technically follow while spiritually violating every principle Catherine holds dear. Foreign courts watch the French dining civil war with fascination. The English ambassador reports to London that French nobles spend more energy fighting about forks than defending their borders. Spanish courtiers place bets on whether Catherine's reforms will survive or collapse. You intercept a letter from the Holy Roman Emperor wondering if dining discord might make France vulnerable to invasion. Perhaps armies could attack during dinner when half the nobles refuse to coordinate their response. The propaganda war escalates. Catherine commissions paintings depicting civilized dining as the pinnacle of human achievement, while rebels circulate woodcuts showing French nobles enslaved by Italian utensils. One particularly inflammatory image shows Catherine as a spider spinning webs of napkins to trap French nobility. She responds by having the artist's dining privileges revoked, a fate worse than exile for someone dependent on court feasts. Moderate nobles attempt compromise. The Duke of Anjou proposes French-style refinement, keeping some Italian innovations while maintaining essential French character. His suggested reforms include forks for certain foods, but not others, napkins on alternate Tuesdays, and conversation restrictions that exclude only actual murders rather than discussions of death. Catherine rejects the compromise as barbarism with extra steps, while hardline rebels call it collaboration with the macaroni enemy. Then, you witness the rebellion's last major stand at the wedding of a prominent rebel's daughter. The father insists on traditional dining. The bride demands Catherine's protocols, and the result is chaos. Half the guests use forks, while the other half demonstrably eat with their hands. The wedding feast becomes a battlefield with utensils as weapons, not for fighting, but for ideological warfare. When the bride bursts into tears because her new husband wipes his mouth on his sleeve, the symbolic defeat of the old ways seems complete. The mainstream historical fact that etiquette violations could result in social exile becomes personal when you watch the Duke of Montmorency, the rebellion's leader, gradually lose influence. Younger nobles avoid association with his backward ways. His own son publicly uses a fork at court, while the Duke watches from an increasingly isolated corner. The rebellion doesn't end with surrender, but with irrelevance. A generation raised on Catherine's rules simply can't imagine eating any other way. You watch from the palace windows as a messenger arrives from Spain, his mud-splattered doublet bearing the Habsburg eagle. Within hours, Catherine's dining innovations face their greatest test. Can French etiquette survive contact with other European courts? The Spanish ambassador requests a demonstration of these revolutionary table manners to report back to Philip II. What starts as curiosity will become a continental contagion, spreading Catherine's rules like a civilized plague across European nobility. The demonstration dinner becomes a masterclass in cultural imperialism. You observe Catherine orchestrating every detail, transforming the meal into a theatrical production of French sophistication. Spanish observers take copious notes as French nobles perform their etiquette like trained dancers, forks moving in synchronization, napkins dabbed in unison, conversation flowing within approved boundaries. The Duke of Alba, Spain's most feared military commander, looks genuinely intimidated by a properly set place setting. Word spreads with remarkable speed. Within months, you track reports from across Europe as Catherine's dining reforms infect other courts. The Queen of Portugal orders forks from Italian merchants. The Holy Roman Emperor mandates individual plates at imperial banquets. Polish nobles attempt napkin folding with limited success. Their efforts resemble origami bears more than proper table linens. The mainstream historical fact that forks reached England through Thomas Coriat in 1611 seems quaint when you realize Catherine launched the continental fork invasion 60 years earlier. The adaptation process varies wildly by culture. German courts, with their love of order, embrace the rules with frightening enthusiasm. You read reports of Bavarian nobles creating dining regulations that make Catherine's seem casual, measuring the exact angle of knife placement with protractors. Meanwhile, Italian courts smirk at French attempts to discover what they've practiced for centuries, though even they adopt some of Catherine's more innovative restrictions. You're amused by the competitive etiquette arms race that develops. If French nobles use silver forks, Spanish nobles commission gold ones. When Catherine introduces flavored water for finger washing between courses, Austrian courts respond with rosewater fountains at each place setting. The English, determined not to be outdone, despite considering the whole thing poncy continental nonsense, create elaborate rules about tea service that no one else understands or cares about. Religious differences complicate the spread. Protestant courts initially reject Catherine's reforms as Catholic decadence, but their own desire for distinction from peasant classes proves stronger than theological objections. You observe Dutch Calvinist merchants adopting simplified versions, plain napkins instead of embroidered, wooden-handled forks rather than silver, but the essential civilizing elements remain. Even austere Protestants can't resist the appeal of not eating like barbarians. The economic impact ripples across Europe. Italian craftsmen can barely keep pace with demand for dining implements. You follow Venetian glassmakers who become wealthy enough to buy palaces, German metalworkers who pivot from armor to utensils, and Dutch textile workers who specialize in napkin production. The quirky historical detail that some regions developed signature dining implements, Nuremberg's elaborate mechanical forks, Toledo's impossibly sharp rounded knives, turns dinner tables into displays of national craftsmanship. Eastern European courts provide the most entertainment. You read a diplomat's report from Moscow where boyars attempt to use forks while wearing thick fur gloves, resulting in spectacular failures. The King of Poland reportedly practiced with his new utensils for 3 months before hosting a state dinner. Hungarian nobles compromise by using forks for certain dishes while maintaining traditional knife-and-hand techniques for their beloved goulash, creating a hybrid etiquette that would horrify Catherine. The youth embrace change fastest, as always. You observe young European nobles studying in Paris specifically to learn proper dining etiquette, returning home as evangelists for Catherine's system. They correct their parents, reform their local courts, and marry only those who share their civilized values. Within a generation, barbaric eating becomes the mark of the hopelessly provincial. A German princess rejects 3 suitors based solely on their inability to properly hold wine glasses. Resistance movements mirror those in France, but with national characteristics. Spanish grandees host conquistador feasts where they eat with swords to prove their martial superiority to French refinement. English lords develop hunting dinners where utensils are banned and meat must be carved with personal daggers. But these rebellions feel performative. You notice the same nobles carefully practicing Catherine's etiquette when they think no one's watching. The standardization of European dining creates unexpected diplomatic benefits. Ambassadors can now attend foreign courts without fear of committing gross cultural errors. International marriages become easier when both parties share dining expectations. You witness the first truly European state dinner where representatives from 12 nations eat with identical etiquette. Their national differences expressed only through food choices rather than eating methods. Cultural fusion produces delightful innovations. Swedish courts combine Catherine's fork techniques with their traditional smorgasbord, creating elaborate self-service etiquette. Portuguese nobles adapt individual plates to accommodate their seafood-heavy cuisine. Even the Ottoman Empire, through its European ambassadors, begins incorporating some Western dining elements, though they draw the line at chairs, maintaining their floor cushion traditions. By 1555, you realize Catherine has achieved something remarkable. She's created the first truly international etiquette system. From Lisbon to Vienna, Stockholm to Naples, European nobles eat with fundamentally similar manners. The specific rules vary, but the core principle that dining requires specialized implements, individual space, and behavioral restrictions has triumphed. A French noble can dine in any European court without embarrassment, and vice versa. Catherine hasn't just revolutionized French dining, she's civilized a continent, one fork at a time. You venture beyond the palace walls into a Parisian tavern where the common people gather, and the scene is both familiar and alien. A blacksmith tears into a loaf of bread, with hands still dusted with soot, while merchants share wooden bowls of stew, passing a single spoon between them. The contrast with Catherine's regulated palace dining couldn't be starker, yet you notice something peculiar. The baker's wife delicately wipes her mouth with her sleeve, in a motion that distinctly mimics napkin dabbing. The trickle down effect begins in predictable ways. Wealthy merchants who supply the palace return home with tales of individual plates and bizarre pronged instruments. You watch a cloth trader proudly display a fork to his guild brothers, who examine it like a holy relic. The queen uses 30 of these at every meal, he boasts, conveniently forgetting to mention he's never actually seen Catherine eat. Within weeks, every merchant with pretensions has commissioned their own noble fork, though most have no idea how to use it. The parody performances in street theaters prove more educational than mockery. You attend a comedy show where actors exaggerate court dining rituals to absurd extremes, using rake handles as forks and bed sheets as napkins. The audience howls with laughter, but you notice them unconsciously absorbing the basic concepts. A seamstress beside you mutters, though a small cloth for wiping might not be the worst idea. Planting seeds that will bloom into middle-class respectability. Economic accessibility shapes adaptation creatively. While nobles use silver forks, craftsmen carve wooden versions, where aristocrats employ individual ceramic plates. Commoners partition shared wooden trenchers with knife marks. You observe a carpenter who creates family forks, larger utensils meant for sharing, but still maintaining the basic principle of not touching food directly. The mainstream historical fact that metal utensils remained luxury items for centuries makes these wooden innovations seem both practical and poignant. The guild system accelerates adoption. Merchant guilds, desperate to distinguish themselves from common laborers, begin instituting civilized dining requirements for membership. You attend a goldsmith guild dinner where nouveau riche artisans fumble with homemade forks, their calloused hands struggling with delicate movements. The master of ceremonies actually provides a training session before the meal, teaching grown men to eat as if they're Catherine's child students. Churches become unexpected evangelists for certain reforms. While bishops might dine with Catherine's full regalia, parish priests preach simplified versions to their flocks. Cleanliness of body reflects cleanliness of soul, becomes a popular sermon theme. You witness a village priest blessing wooden spoons individually assigned to each family member, inadvertently spreading the individual utensil concept through religious authority. The quirky historical detail that some parishes began including proper eating in pre-marriage counseling seems less absurd when you consider eating together was the primary married activity. The generational divide cuts across class lines. Young apprentices mock their masters' barbaric eating while secretly practicing gentle techniques. You observe a blacksmith's son teaching his sister to hold a stick like a fork, both giggling at their pretension while seriously committed to eating proper. Their father catches them and delivers a lecture about honest working class values that's undermined by his wife sneaking them wooden utensils she's hidden in her apron. Public health improvements provide practical justification. After a particularly nasty outbreak of what you recognize as probably dysentery, linked to a tavern's communal bowls, even skeptics begin seeing merit in individual eating implements. A doctor, influenced by Catherine's Italian physicians, publishes a pamphlet linking shared cups to disease transmission. Though his science is shaky, his timing is perfect. Suddenly, refusing to share utensils becomes health conscious rather than pretentious. The adaptation varies dramatically by profession. Soldiers maintain aggressive eating styles but add token refinements, wiping knives before sheathing them, using bread as primitive plates. Sailors, faced with ship movement, reject forks entirely but embrace in individual bowls for practical reasons. You're amused watching fishmongers attempt Catherine's conversation restrictions while gutting mackerel, discussing philosophy with bloody hands that somewhat undermines their civilized aspirations. Rural areas resist longest but fall hardest. You travel to a farming village where Catherine's reforms are legend more than reality. The local lord returns from court with new ideas, instituting proper dining at harvest feasts. The sight of field workers attempting to eat with borrowed forks while exhausted from threshing is simultaneously comic and tragic. Yet within a season, younger farmhands fashion their own utensils, finding that eating like lords provides psychological escape from physical drudgery. Markets adapt to new demands. Pottery stalls that once sold at only cooking vessels now offer personal bowls at various price points. Traveling merchants hawk miracle forks, supposedly blessed by Italian bishops. You observe a clever tinker who transforms old spoons into primitive forks by adding tines, creating affordable hybrid utensils for aspiring middle classes. The economic ecosystem reshaping around dining habits proves Catherine's reforms have achieved unstoppable momentum. The incomplete translation of etiquette creates unique common people customs. Without access to multiple forks, families develop elaborate cleaning rituals between courses. Lacking proper napkins, they create specific hand-washing ceremonies that become social events. You witness a tavern where patrons bring personal wooden plates from home, stacking them like modern restaurant regulars with favorite coffee mugs. These adaptations lack Catherine's aesthetic elegance, but maintain her core principle, dining as deliberate, regulated activity rather than animal feeding. By decade's end, you realize Catherine has achieved something perhaps unintended, but more profound than converting nobles. She's created aspiration itself, the idea that how you eat determines who you are. A London merchant visiting Paris can distinguish social classes by dining habits more accurately than by clothing. The son of a baker dreams not of wealth, but of owning a complete set of eating utensils. Catherine didn't just change how French nobility ate, she fundamentally altered what civilization means to everyone who witnesses it, from palace to pigsty. You stand in a modern restaurant, watching diners unconsciously perform rituals that would make Catherine de' Medici smile from beyond the grave. The businessman at table 3 places his napkin on his lap with the same precision a 16th century duke learned through terror and repetition. The couple on their first date navigates multiple forks with anxiety that mirrors French nobles fumbling through Catherine's first reformed banquets. Nearly 500 years later, her ghost presides over every formal meal. The DNA of Catherine's reforms runs through contemporary dining like an unbreakable thread. You observe a mother correcting her child's grip on a fork, using almost identical language to Catherine's Italian instructors. Hold it like a pencil, not a sword, she says, unknowingly echoing lessons from 1547. The mainstream historical fact that modern Western etiquette derives directly from Renaissance court customs becomes viscerally real. Watching a 5-year-old struggle with utensils exactly as noble children did centuries ago. Modern business dinners reveal Catherine's power dynamics perfectly preserved. You watch executives jockey for seating positions with the same intensity as dukes competing for proximity to royalty. The CEO sits where Catherine would have placed the king, the newest employee relegated to social Siberia near the kitchen doors. The power lunch is simply Catherine's political dining, stripped of titles, but maintaining identical hierarchies expressed through table geography. The conversation restrictions echo eerily across centuries. Modern diners avoid politics, religion, and bodily functions. Catherine's banned topics repackaged as professional courtesy. You overhear a job interview conducted over lunch where the candidate desperately searches for appropriate small talk, his panic identical to a count trying to avoid discussing the latest execution while maintaining approved conversation. The silver bell has been replaced by awkward silence and changed subjects, but the censorship remains. Dating rituals preserve Catherine's reforms with religious devotion. You observe a young man practicing his table manners before an important dinner, watching YouTube videos that unknowingly teach Catherine's original specifications. His date judges his civilization level by his fork technique and napkin usage, just as noble families once evaluated suitors. The quirky historical detail that table manners compatibility appears on modern dating apps would amuse Catherine. Her system has literally become a mating selection criterion. Fast food attempts to destroy Catherine's legacy, but paradoxically reinforces it. The very existence of casual dining implies its opposite, formal dining that requires special behavior. You notice even in McDonald's, people unconsciously follow modified versions of her rules. They use napkins, avoid pointing with French fries, and maintain conversation boundaries. The rebellion against formal dining accidentally acknowledges its power by defining itself in opposition. Cultural variations reveal how deeply Catherine's concepts penetrated global consciousness. Japanese restaurants enforce even stricter etiquette, building on her foundation. American steakhouses rebel with deliberate casualness that still requires knowing which rules you're breaking. French restaurants maintain her systems with fundamentalist fervor, their waiters channeling the spirit of her Italian dining masters. Every culture adapts her basic premise. Eating in public requires performance. You attend a state dinner at the Élysée Palace, where Catherine's protocols survive virtually unchanged. Individual plates sized by rank, larger for more important guests. Utensils specialized beyond her wildest dreams, fish forks, dessert spoons, butter knives multiplying like elegant bacteria. The conversation flows within boundaries she established, nobody discussing disease or death over the foie gras. The president sits where kings once ruled, diplomatic seating charts creating international incidents just as they did in 1550. Children's etiquette classes reveal the continued trauma of civilization. You observe a Little Ladies and Gentlemen course where 6-year-olds learn table manners with the same rigid intensity as Catherine's noble children. Parents pay hundreds of dollars for what was once imposed by royal decree. The instructor, a severe woman who could be Catherine's reincarnation, corrects posture and fork angles with identical fervor. The children's expressions, concentrated terror mixed with desperate desire to please, haven't changed in 5 centuries. The psychological impact remains profound. You witness a woman anxiety spiraling because she used the wrong fork at a business dinner, convinced her career is over. A man practices eating soup silently for hours before meeting his girlfriend's parents. These aren't rational responses to utensil choice. They're deep programming that eating incorrectly equals social death. Catherine weaponized shame so effectively it became hereditary. Wedding etiquette reveals Catherine's ultimate victory. Modern brides stress over seating charts with life or death intensity, channeling her political calculations. Reception dinners enforce formal place settings that most guests use once per lifetime. You observe wedding planners explaining fork placement to caterers, preserving rules whose origins they couldn't name, but whose violation they know means disaster. The wedding industrial complex is essentially Catherine's dining reforms monetized. Technology can't escape her influence. Food photography follows composition rules that mirror her table aesthetic: individual plates, proper utensil placement, napkins folded just so. Instagram influencers unconsciously recreate Catherine's visual standards. Dating apps let people filter by dining compatibility. Zoom dinners during lockdowns maintained etiquette standards, people setting proper places for virtual meals. Even digital dining bows to her ghost. The resistance continues too. You notice authentic restaurants advertising communal dining, shared plates, eating with hands, marketed as exotic experiences that would have been standard pre-Catherine. Food trucks rebel against formal dining, but still provide napkins and maintain service order. The very need to explicitly reject her rules proves their continued power. You can't escape Catherine's influence. You can only consciously violate it. Watching modern diners navigate wine selection, you realize Catherine's transformation went beyond mere table manners. She created anxiety around eating itself, making a biological necessity into a social minefield. The sommelier approaching with wine list might as well be her Italian enforcer, testing whether you'll reveal barbarism through incorrect glass holding. Every meal becomes a test most people don't realize they're taking, but fear failing. Her true legacy isn't forks or napkins, but the permanent insecurity that you might be eating wrong. You enter the great hall of Fontainebleau for Catherine de' Medici's final grand banquet in 1574, and the transformation from that chaotic medieval feast 40 years ago takes your breath away. Crystal glasses catch candlelight like captured stars. Individual plates gleam with heraldic designs, and the silence, my God, the civilized silence, as 300 French nobles eat with synchronized precision, would have been unimaginable when you first arrived in this story. Catherine, now 65 and widowed, surveys her life's work with the satisfaction of a general viewing a conquered territory. The menu itself tells the story of cultural victory. Italian dishes dominate: delicate pasta, refined sauces, gelato molded into architectural fantasies, but served with French ingredients. A culinary marriage that mirrors Catherine's own transformation of French society. You notice even the most conservative nobles eagerly anticipating each course, their former protests against foreign food forgotten in the face of undeniable deliciousness. The Duke of Guise, who once called her the Italian merchant's daughter, now boasts about his Florentine chef. Every element of the meal showcases the complete integration of Catherine's reforms. You watch nobles navigate 7 different forks without hesitation, their movements so practiced they seem born to it. Napkins fold and unfold in choreographed waves. Conversation flows within approved boundaries so naturally that younger attendees can't imagine discussing anything crude over cuisine. The mainstream historical fact that Catherine's dining reforms outlasted her political influence becomes poignantly clear. She may have lost control of France, but she permanently controlled how France eats. The children's table demonstrates generational victory. Young nobles who learned etiquette in Catherine's academy now teach their own offspring. You observe a 6-year-old correcting a servant's place setting with the authority of someone who's never known uncivilized dining. These children will grow up considering forks as natural as fingers, individual plates as obvious as breathing. Catherine watches them with particular satisfaction. They're living proof that culture, once changed, can become hereditary. Foreign ambassadors attending the banquet represent a transformed Europe. The Spanish ambassador uses his fish fork with practiced ease. The imperial representative from Vienna demonstrates napkin techniques that would impress Catherine's own Italian masters. Even the English delegation, arriving from a court that once mocked continental refinement, performs dining etiquette flawlessly. You realize Catherine didn't just civilize France. She created an international language of dining that transcends national boundaries. The integration of all her reforms creates a symphony of civilization. Individual plates prevent grabbing, rounded knives eliminate violence, glasses reduce disease transmission, napkins preserve clothing, conversation restrictions maintain peace, and the complex choreography of service emphasizes hierarchy without chaos. You watch this elaborate dance and understand Catherine turned eating from necessary barbarism into high art. The quirky historical detail that this banquet required 847 pieces of silverware seems reasonable when you see how each utensil serves both practical and symbolic purposes. Between courses, Catherine rises to address the assembly, a rare honor that silences even whispered conversations. When I arrived in France, she begins, her accent still faintly Italian after all these years. I found a great nation that ate like beasts. Tonight, I dine with the most civilized court in Christendom. The applause is genuine, even from former enemies. The Count of Toulouse, whose father led the resistance, stands first in ovation. Revolution becomes tradition within a single generation. You notice the subtle ways Catherine's system has evolved beyond her original vision. Nobles have developed their own refinements, specialized utensils she never imagined, conversation techniques that follow her restrictions while achieving remarkable depth, napkin folding that approaches origami art. Her framework proved flexible enough for innovation while rigid enough to maintain core principles. Like all successful cultural imperialism, the colonized have become more devoted than the colonizer. The meal's emotional undercurrents run deep. Catherine's 3 surviving children attend, products of personal tragedy and political disappointment, but they eat with perfect manners. Her reforms succeeded where her maternal guidance failed. You see her watching them with complex expression, pride in their etiquette, mixing with sorrow over their characters. She created perfect diners, but imperfect humans, a trade-off that defines her legacy. As the banquet progresses through 23 courses, each demonstrating different aspects of civilized dining, you observe the complete naturalization of once foreign concepts. No one remembers that forks were devil's instruments, that individual plates seemed selfish, that napkins appeared effeminate. These tools have become invisible through ubiquity. The true mark of Catherine's success is that French nobles can't imagine dining any other way. The final course arrives, an elaborate sugar sculpture depicting the palace of Fontainebleau rendered in perfect miniature, every window crafted from span sugar, every tower topped with candied violets. It's too beautiful to eat, which is precisely the point. Catherine has transformed consumption itself from desperate hunger into aesthetic appreciation. The nobles admire without grabbing, discuss without crudity, eventually taste with such delicacy that destruction becomes reverence. As the evening concludes, you realize you're witnessing the end of Catherine's personal story, but the permanent establishment of her system. Tomorrow she'll face political intrigue, religious warfare, and family dysfunction. But tonight, in this perfectly orchestrated meal, she's achieved immortality. Every fork raised, every napkin dabbed, every conversation carefully contained within acceptable boundaries proves that culture, once transformed, develops its own momentum. The nobles file out in order of precedence, another of Catherine's innovations, now accepting as natural law. You linger, watching servants clear the elaborate settings, each piece handled with reverence appropriate to religious artifacts, which, in a sense, they are sacred objects in the religion of civilization Catherine established. In the emptying hall, Catherine remains seated at the high table, her posture still perfect despite her age. A servant approaches with her personal effects, including the original fork she brought from Italy 4 decades ago. She holds it up to the light, this simple instrument that revolutionized a culture, and allows herself a small, private smile. The barbarians have been civilized. The Italian merchant's daughter has conquered France more thoroughly than any military commander. And somewhere in your own time, 5 centuries later, her ghost will preside over every formal dinner, every business lunch, every first date where someone worries about which fork to use. The transformation is complete, though its echoes will ripple through centuries. As you drift back through time toward your own era, you carry with you the knowledge of how thoroughly one determined woman can reshape civilization itself. The forks in your kitchen drawer, the napkin on your lap, the careful spacing of your dinnerware all bear Catherine's invisible fingerprints. You understand now that manners aren't just arbitrary rules, but weapons of cultural warfare, tools of social control, and ultimately, the building blocks of what we call civilization. Every time you hesitate over which utensil to use, every moment you dab your lips with careful precision, every instance you bite your tongue rather than discuss politics over dessert, you're performing rituals established by a teenage Italian bride who refused to accept barbarism. The soft comfort of returning to your own time brings new appreciation for these dining conventions you once took for granted. They seem less like restrictions now and more like architecture, invisible structures that shape human interaction in profound ways. Catherine didn't just teach France to use forks. She proved that culture itself can be engineered one meal at a time. Your journey through her revolution leaves you changed, more aware of the theater inherent in every shared meal. The next time you sit down to dinner, you'll feel her presence, not as a ghost, but as an architect whose blueprint still determines how we perform the daily ritual of transforming food into society. Her greatest trick wasn't making barbarism disappear, but making civilization seem inevitable. Sweet dreams settle over you like a perfectly folded napkin, soft and encompassing in your drowsing mind. The clink of crystal glasses becomes a lullaby. The whisper of silk napkins transforms into white noise more soothing than any fan. You've witnessed the birth of the modern dinner table and understood its profound implications for human behavior. Now rest, knowing that tomorrow you'll wake to a world still shaped by one woman's refusal to dine with barbarians. The forks will be waiting, the napkins folded, the conversation polite. Catherine's revolution is complete, and we are all, whether we know it or not, her perfectly trained children, eating with the manners she demanded and the dignity she enforced, forever and ever, until the last formal dinner is served at the end of time.